Good morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this non-partisan congressional briefing on science diplomacy being hosted by the University of Delaware and the offices of US Senator Chris Coons and Senator Lisa Murkowski. My name is Saleem Ali, and I am a professor of geography and spatial sciences at the University of Delaware's College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment and the Biden School of Public Policy. The United States has a distinguished history of scientific cooperation with countries worldwide, including substantive efforts such as the Science Envoys and Embassy Science Fellows Program through the State Department's Office of Science and Technology Cooperation. Yet the pandemic has brought forth a global erosion of trust in science, which has also been felt in the United States and its interactions at the diplomatic level. Our goal in the next hour will be to hear from a range of leaders in science and the practice of innovation to seek their guidance for policymakers on how to rebuild trust in science and enable its use most effectively for planetary sustainability. Each of the panelists will respond to a set of specific questions that have been prepared in consultations with congressional stakeholders and will have 3 to 4 minutes to respond. We will then open up the floor to questions from the audience, which will be curated through the chat feature of Zoom by congressional staff. If we're not able to address all questions within the time, there will be opportunities for further offline engagement where possible with the panelists. Now, to start the conversation, let us consider the role of institutions where science is most often practiced, and that's universities. Our first framing question is for the Provost of Harvard University, Alan Garber. You will recall from the program that we were scheduled to have Professor Larry Bacow, the president of Harvard, joining us, but because of some health issues, he's unable to join. However, we are very fortunate to have Alan Garber come in at short notice. Alan is particularly suited for this role because he's one of those very rare individuals who has a PhD in economics and an MD in medicine. So he really covers academia across the board from social sciences to natural sciences as well. Now, Alan, given your experience as a leader of one of the world's leading research universities in terms of your role as the chief academic officer, what do you see as the most serious international challenges to US competitiveness and higher education in science? And as you think about efforts by US policymakers to address potential national security concerns, how might we also address the risk of an erosion of independence in research collaboration? Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. We certainly do hear a great deal about the geopolitical risks of international collaborations. But as a leader of a large research university, I also understand the risks of turning inward, of making it more difficult or less attractive for the world's most promising students and scholars to come and learn what makes this country great, or to join us in pursuit of discovery. I also understand the importance of international collaborations to unlocking scientific advances and addressing national and global challenges. Science is becoming more international, and technological leaps enabled by fundamental research are occurring around the globe. While the US maintains scientific leadership in many fields, we are playing a less dominant role in others. By way of example, in 1960, the US accounted for approximately 69% of the world's R&D funding. In 2018, it was 28%. The lesson is clear. If we are to remain among the world's leaders across all scientific fields and to continue to benefit from research conducted at home and abroad, the US must engage with the international science community. Important discoveries are made all the time by individual scientists and small teams, but some of the most transformative work is being conducted by large teams with access to centers of excellence and state-of-the-art facilities across the world. As one example, the 2017 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to the 3 founders of LIGO for the first ever observation of gravitational waves. The laureates made an exceptional contribution to the field, but their work was built on the cross-border collaboration of physicists and astronomers, as evidenced by one of the group's most important papers, which involved 355 co-authors from more than 20 countries. In fact, many of our most complex scientific challenges transcend national boundaries. For that reason, issues of science are increasingly on the foreign policy agenda of governments, and we must work with friends and competitors alike to make progress. At Harvard, the medical school collaborated with researchers from several countries, including China, to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. China's past experience with SARS and the lessons learned from the clinical management of patients, diagnostics, and transmission modeling were key to saving lives. At a time when the US was scrambling to understand and characterize the threat, this collaboration accelerated learning and facilitated our progress. In short, our success would not have been possible without open, collaborative science. Our experience underscored for me that universities are a source of strength and progress through turbulent economic, political, and social times. And our faculty experts have a critical role to play in informing policy responses at all levels of government, as well as globally. As politics confine some interstate relationships, universities have an important contribution to make. The pursuit of knowledge creates bonds that join scholars across borders, establishing the relationships and the common ground that enhances our nation's power globally. It supports the creation of a framework for research based on openness, integrity, and excellence. And it enhances the standing of the US internationally when its leadership role is used for the benefit of people everywhere. Research universities recognize that effective approaches to global challenges, be it climate change or pandemics, will not be developed by a single nation. Strategic collaboration is critical, recognizing that we are better when we learn from each other. To be successful, we must help policymakers understand how science can inform foreign policy and global governance. For these reasons, we nurture human and intellectual capital. How we nurture human and intellectual capital is extraordinarily consequential. At Harvard, we welcome individuals from around the world who will make meaningful contributions on campus and beyond. We are innovative because we value diversity in every possible dimension, embracing those who challenge our thinking and will contribute to future advances. Universities represent opportunity, and in our policy responses, we should avoid nationalistic approaches that would exclude the world's best or create barriers to mutually beneficial collaborations. There are risks to international collaborations, and we should be clear-eyed about those challenges. But openness in fundamental science is important to our security and prosperity, and to the other priorities that we share with the world. To quote Louis Pasteur, "Science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world." To that end, I hope open science and policy will grow to become close companions in the effort to solve global problems, illuminating all that is possible when we work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Provost Garber, for that illuminating and candid presentation, and especially the quote from Pasteur is very telling from even those times when there was not the same level of infrastructure for collaboration. Our next panelist is joining us from China, where it is quite late in the evening, and we're very grateful to him for staying up so late. Professor Tong Shijun is the Chancellor of New York University's Shanghai campus. NYU Shanghai is a monumental example of the epistemic bridges across the oceans that universities can build in the name of science. The question I have for you, Dr. Tong, is how do you see both America and China navigating research and student partnerships in these times of trust erosion? Are there specific lessons in cross-cultural understanding which you may share that could inform how policymakers see the US-China relationship? Thank you, and over to you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Ali, it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to say some words about scientific collaboration on the basis of my personal experiences, as well as many things more I have learned. Yeah, I can shoot. I would start with a story, a fable. Actually, I learned as a second grader in my small mountain village many years ago. Two generals went to the market to buy a shield together, and the craftsman showed him his finest product. One general said, "What a great gold shield," and the other said, "It's a great shield, but it's a silver." The generals argued and argued again until the craftsman showed them that the shield had two sides, one of gold and one of silver. And I would also like to share a story, a real story I learned as a philosophy graduate student also many years ago. It turns out that Einstein's general theory of relativity only gained widespread acceptance when it was certified and popularized by the astronomer Arthur S. Eddington in 1915. Even though Einstein's Germany and Eddington's England were at war for years, the scientists were partners in science for the benefit of all humanity. To me, these stories reveal that the most powerful catalyst of scientific progress is collaboration and the exchange of different opinions of views. Colleagues who help you see the other side of the shield. Researchers willing to reach across borders to expand the boundaries of scientific knowledge. In my own life, I have benefited from the experience of international academic partnership. I did my doctoral studies in Bergen, Norway. I did a Fulbright year at the Columbia University. I have attended conferences all over the world, from Reykjavik to Dubrovnik to Rio de Janeiro. Actually, as a university leader, I also visited once University of Delaware. In my current work, that's the main point. I'm proud that NYU Shanghai's fundamental mission is to promote collaboration and exchange. Our faculty come from more than 27 countries. Our 2,000 students are 50% Chinese and 50% international. Side by side, they bring different perspectives to bear on common human challenges, and they promote human progress. There is no better way to strengthen a mutual understanding and trust among people than for them to work together as members of the same scientific community. As we all know, many voices today lament a weakening of mutual understanding and trust. But I'm happy to say that anyway, Shanghai is an example of how such vital understanding and trust between China and the US endures. To continue to work together, we must remain eager to learn from one another's experiences, as Professor Alan Garber just said, learn from each other. My experiences in the world of Chinese education include experiences before and after the Cultural Revolution, experiences before and after China's opening up and reform, experiences before and after the normalization of Sino-US relations,
Thank you so much, Chancellor Tong, for that very personal exposition. And on a personal note, I might add that my oldest son is doing his PhD in public health at NYU, and he's also fluent in Mandarin. And so at some point, hope he will cross paths with you.
Yes.
Now, let's turn our attention to a very focused area of research collaboration, which has come under particular scrutiny and stress during the pandemic. We are joined by Dr. Peter Daszak, who is president of the EcoHealth Alliance in New York and was part of the WHO's expert team that recently visited Wuhan and other parts of China to investigate the origins of the pandemic. Now, Dr. Daszak, as a researcher who has had to contend with the fallout of the pandemic's impact on research related to zoonotic diseases, what could be specific parameters of future national policies within the US, as well as international mechanisms that could prevent some of the challenges you encountered? Would a pandemic treaty be a suitable way forward?
Well, there's no doubt that politics have played a key role in COVID-19 at every step, from the first report of the outbreak through to, the lost February around the rest of the world outside China, where we sort of waited and watched this thing spreading insidiously. And I think we need a hard look at how we enabled COVID to spread in front of us almost to become the worst pandemic in 104 years. Our strategy at EcoHealth Alliance is to try and understand pandemics, to analyze what's causing them so we can look for patterns that we can use to predict them, and then we can try and prevent them. If we can predict when or where the next pandemics will emerge, we can go to those places and reduce the risk of that. And what we found, with some very good science from a lot of different organizations, that, pandemics are, they're not rare, they're infrequent, 1 every 10 years or so. But actually, they're the tip of the iceberg. There are dozens of outbreaks every year, every month, from really serious pathogens. There are 5 new emerging diseases on average that affect people every year. And the majority of those come from animals. They exploit our global footprint through globalized travel and trade, deforestation, expansion of agriculture that drives people into close contact with animals that carry viruses, like the SARS coronaviruses that led to COVID-19. So how are we going to deal with this? And it really does get into a political realm. And I think there are really 4 steps. Step 1 is absolutely crystal clear to all of us in this field. And we need to partner with the countries where emerging diseases tend to originate, whether they're our allies or our competitors. It's to the benefit of everybody's health and our own national security to do that. And that has real relevance both to the right and to the left in terms of helping build capacity in countries that are on the front line and protecting our own citizens against health threats. There are some programs here in the US that are absolutely critical to this. We need to strengthen USAID's efforts to build capacity in emerging disease hotspots through their Emerging Pandemic Threats program in the Global Health section. Department of Defense has the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and a biothreat reduction program that builds positive cooperation with scientists in the US and those in security hotspots. And NIH NIAID has launched Centers for Research in Emerging Infectious Disease in a CREED program in the countries where diseases originate. That's critical. We need to look outward. Step 2, I know of no other existential threat to our species that we don't track spend money on tracking and doing surveillance and forecasting and preventing. Think of hurricanes and the weather forecasting network. Think of terrorism surveillance after 9/11 in the US and how much funding and effort goes into that, and how we deal with even the whisper of an attack. We stop it before it happens. But we don't even know how many viruses are out there on the planet yet. And that to me is incredible. We estimate there are about 1.7 million unknown viruses in wildlife. It would only cost just over $1 billion to identify 70% of them, the most common and most threatening. We need a global approach to do that. We called for a global virome project a couple of years ago. We now need to build that international partnership, identify these pathogens, sequence them, and start designing measures against them. Step 3, once we know what the threats are out there, we can then do something really different. We can build drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines that don't just act against the latest one, but act against all of them. Remdesivir has been tested against the bat coronaviruses that we've discovered in China with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, Adagio's ADG2, and the Universal Coronavirus Vaccine Initiative announced by Dr. Fauci yesterday focuses on using those pre-pandemic bat coronaviruses to say, here's a vaccine that will protect us against what we know and what we don't yet know. And then finally, the critical, most important step, we need a global shift in mindset from response to prevention. We shouldn't be waiting for pandemics to emerge and then scrabbling to deal with them. With $18 trillion plus in economic damages, it doesn't make economic sense. And we calculated a return on investment of dealing with the wildlife trade and deforestation. It's 2 orders of magnitude return on investment. So a pandemic treaty is a good first step. Building preparedness is really important. Universal coronavirus vaccines are really important. But in the IPBES pandemic report that I headed, we called for a new intergovernmental high council on pandemic prevention. That's not yet laid out. And that needs to bring in the economic drivers through the private sector, through our own consumption patterns. And we need to start thinking, like climate change, about reducing them for the benefit of future generations. You know, if we can do that, we get 3 returns on investment. We protect our future children's health, we protect the biodiversity and the ecosystem services we get from that, and we reduce climate change. So I hope we will all call for that sort of global effort for pandemic prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daszak. Now, staying on the topic of public health, our next panelist will help us understand how trust in science can be built from the grassroots, particularly in developing countries. Dr. Tolullah is a public health physician and urban epidemiologist at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and she's also a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which is the formal UK advisory mechanism. So Dr. Oni, as an urban epidemiologist who's worked in Europe and Africa, what are some of the key lessons that policymakers can draw from the way public health education can mitigate distrust in science? How might such efforts operate at different scales of government?
Thank you, Saleem. And just to clarify, I'm a member of a subcommittee on a subgroup on ethnicity of SAGE, but I'm also a member of Independent SAGE, which I'll come on to in a moment. So I'll be making 4 points to respond to your points, Liam, and it very much picks up on the points that Peter just made. So the 4 points I'll be making are, firstly, the need to transcend silos of health and disease to prevent the preventable. The second is on the importance of local, so local is best. The third is on building public trust and approaches to doing that. And lastly, the fourth is on optimizing science advisory mechanisms. So the first on transcending silos. There are 2 aspects of this. So I'm a public health physician, and just picking up on that point of prevention, there are 2 aspects that I find of health that I find frustrating. The first is that we know that health is much more than healthcare. So we know that the majority of factors that influence health lie outside of healthcare. So while healthcare is really critical, the environments where people live and work play a really important role. And we've seen that with the pandemic, where these environments have significantly influenced the different COVID outcomes we've seen in different communities. But these environments which play a really critical role in health are rarely held accountable for population health. So we've seen in the pandemic the importance of the quality of housing you live in on disease transmission, of access to public spaces for safe exercise, of clean air, because we know that air pollution increases the risk of severe COVID. But the pandemic has also shown the feasibility of such integrated action that we need. So there is scope for the kind of evidence that we need to integrate policies across sectors to improve health, as well as more robust data across sectors. So when we talk about surveillance for disease surveillance, we should be talking about integrating disease outcomes with these determinants so that we can readily spot where areas that are most vulnerable and to tailor our prevention and indeed our responses to that. The second aspect of that first point is busting the myths of the dichotomy of infectious and non-communicable diseases. I was asked the other day, well, were we less prepared because we are focusing on non-communicable diseases like diabetes and obesity at the expense of infectious diseases? I mean, I think that's a redundant point. At the end of 2020, the World Obesity Federation showed that COVID mortality rates were more than 10 times higher in countries where overweight prevalence exceeded 50% of adults compared to countries where it was lower than that. So when we talk about pandemic preparedness, we shouldn't be pitting infectious and non-communicable, because we see that these are interrelated and interlinked. So moving forwards, thinking about health systems and policies, we will need to tackle both across these silos of sectors and disease before the next emergency. From a science perspective, we also need to be responsive to these degrees of health influences rather than perpetuating these silos. So when we think about preparedness, I want to introduce, when we're thinking about early warning, that we have early warning systems that are integrated across these silos and disciplines. The second point, local is best. From community action networks in Cape Town in South Africa that supported neighborhoods in need, from the creation of mobile markets by market traders that decentralized a large food market to make fresh foods more accessible in Lagos, Nigeria, to local community contact tracing initiatives in Sheffield in the UK. One thing is clear that has transcended globally: local is best. We've seen communities adapting to address food insecurity, increase vaccination uptake, and protect livelihoods. It's also clear that we have this persisting hubris in the perceptions of where lessons can be learned from, and this is posing a barrier to effective knowledge exchange. So I think the science enterprise can play a really critical role in fostering these sharing of experiences between countries, cities, and towns globally. And in so doing, when we think about preparedness, in addition to early warning, we also need to be thinking about preparedness as early listening. The third point is on building public trust. And I say we shouldn't be waiting for moments of crisis to reach the public with science. The pandemic, as scientists, we often say, oh, no, this is too complicated, the public didn't understand. But we've seen in emergencies that the public are interested in science. We've seen that they are able to grapple with the uncertainties and with the evolution of science when we effectively communicate this. But we've seen a demand for two things from science. One is transparency, and two is accountability. And cutting across those is trust. So rather than seeing building trust as a once-off outreach when it's most needed, we need to be seeing building trust as a journey to build what has been described by someone else as building intellectual antibodies to misinformation, a journey to supporting local action, and critically, a journey that is best begun outside moments of crises. And scientists have a really critical role to play. The most effective initiatives I've seen in this regard by community organizations, but also by academic organizations like national young academies globally, have leveraged pre-existing community links and pre-existing records of public engagement to address this disinformation. So those are the kinds of initiatives that need to be supported by scientific enterprise and governments alike. And my final point, if I may, is the importance of optimizing the science advisory mechanisms. So as you introduced earlier, I'm a member of Independent SAGE. So this was an organization that was convened by the former chief scientific advisor to the United Kingdom in May last year, in response to the need for greater transparency and accountability regarding the communication of scientific evidence and what was behind the science that was behind the recommendations on which policies were being formulated as part of pandemic response, because the formal structures were not sufficiently transparent. And the work that has been happening now has been very much focused on, with Independent SAGE, on making science more accountable, and critically emphasizing the importance of addressing the social, economic, and structural inequalities and discrimination that we see drive the mistrust. So in as much as we have these initiatives as a journey, if we don't address those experiences, we miss a trick. And our experience has emphasized the need for a reevaluation of the relationship between scientists and policymakers at all levels of government, and for the terms of reference to be redrafted. And we need public engagement as part of that terms of reference, so that scientific advances are best able to be used for the benefit of the whole population. And so I would end by calling for the need for a public debate that involves academic institutions, learned societies, I beg your pardon, and local communities on how best to establish effective dialogues between scientists and the public. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oni, and especially for that reality check from the grassroots and the idea of getting the youth involved. I should note that not too long ago in Science, there was an editorial, and the authors are in the audience, which asked for a science score to be established within the US. Just like we have a peace score, maybe we need a science score. So next we turn to global environmental change. Let's move to an area of science diplomacy where there is perhaps some greater level of success in terms of international cooperation. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. Drew Shindell, who is Nicholas Professor of Earth Science at Duke University. Now, Dr. Shindell, given your experiences of working at NASA, as well as your role on various science panels globally, where do you see opportunities for further data diplomacy? Since we're living in this big data environment, especially with artificial intelligence and all utilizing data, can you give us some examples of how greater scientific cooperation in the global environmental change arena can be emulated?
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, as you just said, bodies such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change really serve as an outstanding example of the benefits of global cooperation. They have provided policy-relevant evaluations, which have proven extremely robust and should continue. International cooperation can also help reveal the full spectrum of possibilities. So we often hear that climate science is too uncertain to warrant taking strong action now. But if you ask any insurance company about what worries them more, things they are certain about or things they're uncertain about, they would say the latter. When your bottom line depends upon evaluating risk correctly, you'd be wise to worry about events that are difficult to predict but can cause large damages. As humanity has become, whether we chose to or not, stewards of our planet, we'd similarly be wise to worry about the tail end of the distribution, low probability but high impact outcomes. Doing so requires knowledge of the full distribution of possible futures, and that's an area where there is room for additional progress with focused cooperative global efforts. Global cooperation also provides a strength in bringing together a diversity of projections of the more subjective technological and behavioral changes. We typically assume we'll adopt new technologies at similar rates to those at which we adopted older ones. But while history can serve as a useful guide, it does not necessarily constrain our future, fortunately. As a case in point is how quickly we might alter diets to improve our health with the added benefit of reducing consumption of foods with a high greenhouse gas footprint. In most projections, it takes many decades for even a small shift in behavior to be visible. But in a small number, rapid changes are envisioned. Their mere presence in the set of results changes the discussion on what's possible, with unexpectedly strong impacts on the entire energy transformation due to the effects of the food system on the availability of land to grow forests or biofuels. Implementing such changes will require global efforts to understand how best to improve human welfare in each local context, but first required awareness that these were even within the realm of the possible. Indeed, we need global cooperation not only to study the climate crisis, but to provide evidence of the benefits of mitigation to support doing something about it. Finally, you asked about my time at NASA, but global cooperation on observations has and will continue to pay enormous dividends. An example is the GRACE mission, a pair of satellites flying in tandem with such precision that the trailing one can detect minute deviations in the orbit of the leading one, which reveal the gravitational field of the Earth as they pass overhead. This has been used to detect both ice sheet melting and groundwater depletion, and is a joint project of NASA and the German Space Agency, each of which brought unique expertise to the table. There's ample room for enhanced cooperation, including a planned cooperative network of geostationary satellites from the US, European Union, and Korea that will give an unprecedented look at the entire Northern Hemisphere and can serve as a model for going forward. We share one planet. What better way to understand and protect it than to cooperate across the nations that span our world? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shindell, for those very specific examples, and certainly ones which the current administration is very keen to engage in with a lot of the efforts that are underway with the engagement on global environmental change research, especially with the climate change summit that we had just in late April. Now, our next panelist has experience in tackling some of the more intractable applications of science diplomacy. Joining us from her home in the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean is Dr. Marga Gual, who has been pioneering many novel approaches to using science instrumentally for peace building. Dr. Sola, given your experience of undertaking science diplomacy efforts between the US and Cuba, with your time as a science diplomacy professional with AAAS, what would be your suggestions to US policymakers on driving such initiatives to make substantive impact?
Thank you very much, Professor Ali, and good afternoon, everyone from Mallorca in Spain. As you say, I am a molecular biologist by training, but for the last decade, I've been working at this interface of science and diplomacy as a scholar, policy advisor, and educator. And so Saleem has asked me to share today a very specific experience from one of the most rewarding episodes in my career. Between 2014 and 2019, I was with the Center for Science Diplomacy of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, in short AAAS, in Washington, D.C., during a critical time for the bilateral relationship between the United States and Cuba. And I believe that the lessons learned from advancing scientific collaborations between these two countries can inform the relationship between science and foreign policy more broadly. For the past 200 years, as many of you know, the relations between the United States and Cuba have been subject to complex economic, political, and social dynamics, culminating in the fracture of diplomatic relations in 1961 until the normalization of 2015 under Presidents Obama and Raul Castro. In this process, science and global health diplomacy were key to establishing a trusting and productive relationship based on mutual and global benefit. Despite the political divides, science was one of the few channels of dialogue and collaboration that always remained open, particularly through non-governmental exchanges in the biomedical and environmental sciences. Let me give you one example. Less than 100 miles south of the reefs and mangroves of the Florida Keys lay the marine ecosystems of Cuba. These are some of the best preserved and biodiversity rich in the Caribbean and the Western Hemisphere. Cuban waters provide vital spawning and nursery grounds for fish species that are commercially important to the United States. Cuba is also a major stopover point on migration routes for many North American birds. And in the words of the director of the Cuban Meteorological Institute during Hurricane Sandy, and I quote, a hurricane that hits Cuba does not ask for a visa before entering the United States. Though managed by different nations, ecosystems are bound together by atmospheric, oceanic currents, and animal migrations that do not respect borders or jurisdictions. This is why international scientific engagement is essential to tackling cross-border challenges that no country can solve alone. But also, scientific collaboration can yield important diplomatic benefits more broadly. Science has historically been one of the first pillars of engagement between countries after periods of conflict, as exemplified by the post-war scientific relationships between the United States and Japan, the Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement with China of 1979, which was mentioned earlier, and the classic case of US cooperation with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba in 2015 was no different. Policy revisions by the Obama administration opened a path for expanded cooperation in several priority areas of research that were of common interest to both countries. The first intergovernmental MOUs were signed between the US Department of Health and Human Services and NOAA, with the Ministries of Health, Science, Technology, and Environment of Cuba. For the first time, Cuban-developed medications could enter normal FDA regulatory channels. The NIH initiated a small grants program for joint research in infectious diseases, and a framework was established for the joint monitoring of coral reef ecosystems to better understand the consequences of climate change across the Florida Straits. Most of these agreements were preceded by earlier contacts between scientists trying to find ways for constructive cooperation. Those relationships were maintained through challenging times by the shared interest of individuals and institutions, including American and Cuban universities, the National Academies of Sciences of both countries, scientific societies such as AAAS, the American Physical Society, and others, and environmental and health NGOs. Today, the atmosphere for cooperation is once again uncertain. In 2017, the new US administration halted rapprochement with Cuba, implementing revised policies that, while not explicitly targeting science, severely limited travel and the logistical aspects of scientific collaboration, including banking, fiscal matters, visas, import and export permits for equipment and samples. And this is obviously discouraging both sides from pursuing the joint research programs that were initiated only a few short months or years back. All of this can, of course, translate more broadly to other issues and parts of the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that international science cooperation is in every country's national interest. As it has been emphasized by my fellow panelists, we cannot afford to continue treating global transboundary crises as domestic problems. Open collaboration and data sharing among scientists is essential, not only for understanding the problem and coming up with the solutions, but also for promoting understanding among peoples and nations of different political, cultural, and social backgrounds. Any action or inaction by one country will inevitably impact the other. Bringing science from the margins to the center of diplomacy will allow us to reset our priorities and redefine national security, defense, multilateralism, and global governance. As we have learned in the hardest way, that there are no military solutions against our most pressing challenges, and the only viable path is to work together. Viruses don't carry passports and hurricanes don't request visas. When we're all in this together, national interests are global interests and vice versa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solar. And I should also mention that we do have the chat feature open for questions. If you'd like to type in your questions, we can multitask. Some of the panelists and our congressional staff may be able to also answer them as we move on to the last two panelists. So we next turn to the private sector to gain insights on how businesses can foster science diplomacy. Jacob Parker is Senior Vice President at the US-China Business Council. Given the current tensions between the US and China, Mr. Parker, especially on intellectual property that emanates from scientific research, what suggestions would you have in terms of policies that will give assurance to governments and business that there is appropriate credit for innovation, but also cooperative and efficient market outcomes?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ali. I'd also like to thank the offices of Senators Coons and Murkowski as well for hosting today's events. Great question about intellectual property, and you hit the nail right on the head. The lingering challenges of protecting intellectual property rights in China remains at the center of the bilateral friction between the US and China. That said, in our discussions with our member companies, which are US large Fortune 500 multinational companies, There have been clear improvements in China's IP protection environment over the past decade. Issues that were previously nettlesome, such as protecting copyrights and trademarks, may rank much lower on the hierarchy of needs today. This is the result of continued pressure from external dialogue, a more motivated police that are willing to raid infringing factories in China, and perhaps most importantly, increased domestic IP, which creates an incentive for government to do more on protecting IP domestically. Today, challenges primarily focus on trade secrets and patent protection, which are, of course, at the core of research and development. In the past, the adjudication of these cases is handled by courts with limited IP knowledge. Today, IP cases are increasingly handled by judges with nuanced understanding of IP laws and regulations. There's also increasing awareness from the business partners who license IP from particularly US multinational companies about the importance of protection, which creates more of an impetus domestically on enforcement. Despite these improvements, the number of companies that curtail or choose not to embark in investments in China is not insignificant. We survey our members each year, and what we hear is that the impact of IP rights enforcement limits their products manufactured, licensed, or sold in China, in addition to how those companies invest in research and development activities. For China, improved IP enforcement is not simply a matter of ensuring that IP owners are compensated for their discoveries, it's also an economic issue. When American companies are limiting their operations in China because of the lack of full protection of IP rights, opportunities for job creation and innovation are lost. More can be done by both governments to incentivize innovation in research and development while protecting intellectual property rights. Let me begin with China. First, China should enact a robust trade secrets law. China currently protects trade secrets via a handful of articles in the anti-unfair competition law, the labor contract law, the criminal law, and the company law. Developing a standalone trade secrets law should be a priority and would help better protect the broad range of business and confidential information that companies view and treat as trade secrets. This would also allow for a broader use of judicial procedures on preliminary injunctions, as well as evidentiary prevention orders. This would also reduce the high evidentiary requirements that plaintiffs face during trade secret cases today. Secondly, China should follow international best practices on innovation incentives. China's government should sever the links between China's innovation policies and those that concern government procurement, which currently push government procurement towards domestic companies which have incentivized IP and research and development via those subsidies in China's domestic market. Third, China should create a more robust patent linkage system in China. This would ensure that China's patent linkage system establishes a minimum 24-month stay period for determinations on marketing applications of patented pharmaceuticals and ensure that biologics are covered by this system. China should also immediately withdraw the marketing approvals for the more than 30 products that have received those approvals despite infringing on more than 13 foreign patents. Implementing a strong patent linkage system will ensure such infringing approvals are avoided in the future. Now, just two quick recommendations for the US side as well. The first is to establish a structure for solution-oriented dialogue with enforceable outcomes. The two sides should hold regular IP dialogues to work through these IP challenges that I've described. Dialogue should focus on clearly defined and time-bound priorities and should have a mechanism for dispute resolution and enforceable remedies for failure to implement upon agreed outcomes. Lastly, on tariffs. While imperfect, the US-China Phase 1 trade agreement made important progress on long-standing trade barriers, including IPR protection. The tariffs imposed prior to reaching the agreement, most of which remain in place, have harmed American jobs, consumers, and commercial competitiveness of American companies. We think it would be beneficial to weigh the progress made to date to see what tariffs could be removed. Showing the Chinese government that their progress is rewarded with easing of financial sanctions would not only support the US economy at the cost of a free stimulus, as well as by offering an initial incentive to support additional IP liberalization in the China market. So with that, Dr. Ali, I'll pass it back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Parker, for giving very specific guidance on legal reform and regulatory engagement, and particularly the IP dialogue effort and having an ADR mechanism, an alternative dispute resolution mechanism, is a very concrete example of a way forward. Now, for our final panelist, we consider the most fundamental aspects of science diplomacy, the elements that form the basis of modern technologies, but have become the locus of considerable social and political conflict. This is an area I should note is of particular research interest for me as well, someone who works on minerals. America's northern neighbor, Canada, has particular experience in this regard, and we are joined by Martin Loken, who is the Minister for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Canada. So Minister Loken, as a member of the 5-country Energy Resource Governance Initiative of the US State Department, Canada is playing an important role. Canada is also a major funder of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Metals, and Sustainable Development, which has 78 member states, including countries with challenging foreign policies such as Iran and Russia. What is Canada's vision for geoscience diplomacy, and what might we learn from your experiences thus far?
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Dr. Ali. Really happy to be part of this great conversation, and hats off to the 2 senators' offices and the University of Delaware for bringing us all together. Look, I'd start by saying that right now there's a tremendous spirit of cooperation between our 2 countries, and I guess that's not a great surprise, as Canada and the U.S. are the closest of friends, allies, and partners. And frankly, no country wants the U.S. to succeed as much as Canada does. And amidst all the things that we're doing bilaterally together and multilaterally together, science and technology figures very importantly, and especially in the sectors you mentioned, Dr. Ali, when it comes to energy, when it comes to metals, when it comes to mining. When President Biden had his very first visit with a foreign leader after inauguration, he and Prime Minister Trudeau released what was called the Roadmap for a Renewed Canada-US Partnership. And that roadmap sets out dozens of commitments for the coming years in order to meet our mutual priorities, whether it's combating COVID, building back better, accelerating our climate ambition, and much more. And science is an important thread that runs throughout all of these objectives. I mean, frankly, you can't reach them without science. And one of the elements of this roadmap that I'm most excited about is the commitment to build the necessary supply chains for Canada and the United States to be global leaders in all aspects of battery development and production. And so to that end, our leaders, they agreed to strengthen the existing Canada-United States Critical Minerals Action Plan in regard to batteries for zero-emission vehicles and renewable energy storage and much more. And so what this work is going to do is it's going to enhance what was already a very strong science focus in the collaboration between our 2 countries on critical minerals. And what this feeds into, it helps both our countries build supply chains that are more resilient and secure for the critical materials that in the decades to come are going to be so fundamental for our economic prosperity and national security. And I know this whole notion of supply chain security is of increasing importance here in town, not just for the administration, but also, of course, on the Hill, on both sides of the aisle. And I would say for all this kind of work, you have no better partner than Canada. So maybe going beyond sort of the bilateral work, of course, we need to work at a global scale as well when it comes to science cooperation. It's going to help in many ways. Enhanced cooperation internationally is going to help strengthen the rules-based system more broadly. It's going to help us meet our sustainable development goals. And that's why we in Canada are applying science diplomacy to address resource-based conflicts, corruption, and environmental damage. As you noted, Dr. Ali, we're a founding member of this Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development. It allows Canada to help other countries leverage their resource wealth to pursue sustainable development through better governance, environmental protection, and the sharing of benefits with their communities. And we're delighted that the United States now is taking steps to join the IGF. You mentioned ERGI, the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. So when our leaders met, they agreed to strengthen our collaboration under that important forum, which I think is a very nice complement to the IGF. And so we're very pleased to play our part as we pursue our vision to be the leading mining nation. We also see opportunities in terms of geoscience to expand our cooperation on international standards development. Of course, international competition is fierce in this space, but nevertheless, I think there really is a collective interest in advancing geoscience and in sharing important data. So what I'll just say to wrap up, Dr. Ali, is, frankly, no two countries are working as closely together as ours to tackle the big challenges of the day, whether it's COVID, building back better, climate, strengthening supply chains, and so much more. And science really is an important thread that runs through it all, including geoscience. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Minister Loken. And certainly the IGF's work we will follow with great interest, and especially those more intractable partners who are part of the forum. Now, the questions are coming through in the chat, and some of the panelists may find it worthwhile to respond there because we are short on time, but we can do parallel processing. There is one question that's overarching, that's around prioritization. We are in this really sort of rebound phase post-pandemic. And of course, there will be this sense of, well, let's do something about preparedness. But is there something structural in terms of science diplomacy which you would recommend that the US policymakers should prioritize? And I should note, we were fortunate to have Alondra Nelson join us for a major part of the segment today. She is the Deputy Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And she had very specifically said that she wanted to just be an observer and not speak, but we were very pleased that she could join, and some of her staff are going to convey the remainder of the conversation to her. What might the first priority be? So any of you would like to chime in or also type in, but then we have to wrap up quickly. We may go a little over time, but hopefully we'll be able to wrap up within 5 minutes above time. Any suggestions on prioritization structurally? Okay, yes, Dr. Tong.
Yeah, I think it's very important for scientists from different countries, especially from my perspective, that is scientists from the United States and China, to have more exchanges on the basis of more clarified regulations. For example, all those scientific research leading to publishing results in public sphere should be not only allowed but also encouraged, because as scientific research done by at NYU Shanghai, all our scientific research lead to publicized, results, and this kind of activities should definitely be encouraged. Yeah, that's
and some level of trust in that publication. I think that's also key. A lot of there's concerns about trust in data coming from different sources. And one of the suggestions has been that we need some norms of better data vetting so that there is confidence in terms of like energy data, the data coming from. So I think that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Tong. Well, we're coming to the end of our time period, and I'm glad to see some of the colleagues are responding in the chat, which is the great feature of Zoom that allows us to multitask. So we're going to try and wrap up on schedule, and I'm going to invite Lizzie Hunsaker, Dr. Lizzie Hunsaker from Senator Coons' office, who has been really the leading light in moving this forward within the congressional staff, to give us some closing comments and her thoughts on what she heard.
Thank you so much, Saleem. Hi, everyone. My name is Lizzie Hunsaker, and I'm a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow in Senator Coons' office. I want to thank you for joining this important discussion today. And on behalf of Senator Coons, I'd like to thank the University of Delaware for facilitating this conversation, and Senator Murkowski and her staff for their partnership and organizing. A huge thanks as well to our panelists for sharing their expertise with us through insightful comments, and to Professor Ali for fantastic moderating. Thank you so much. Speaking for myself as a scientist one of my favorite things about this conversation has been hearing how we can improve and build trust and cooperation in science in ways that benefit not only the United States, but countries around the world. And this discussion has really showcased the opportunities and the challenges of cross-cutting and cross-border scientific collaboration, and the support for science and technology that I've seen across the political spectrum in the United States during my time in Congress as a scientist makes me confident that we are up for the task. So thank you again to our panelists for their participation today, and to everyone for joining. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend.
Thank you all. We'll be in touch with follow-up. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone. See you.